So this is a review of kneecap pain, otherwise known as patellofemoral pain. Patella meaning the kneecap, femoral meaning the femur. I think it's pretty important before you're going to do some work at home, strengthening. I think it's pretty important to know the reasons why, what, how, when kneecap pain happens so that you can kind of attack it from all angles. So that's what this is for. Please look at this and listen and understand it, maybe review it a couple times before you do any exercises in the rest of the exercises in the YouTube channel. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the anatomy. What is the kneecap? Okay, it looks like kind of like this, like a home base. And it sits right there in a groove, like a boat in a valley between two mountains on your femur bone here. And here's a model of the kneecap, right? So I'll show you. Home base, right? There's a point at the bottom. It's kind of flat at the top. And then it sits, can you see it? In a groove here. A lot of kind of the early research on kneecap pain just assumed it happened right there. They would say it tilted or whatever, and it's a lot of the early information on how to get through kneecap pain was to strengthen the inside and stretch the outside. It was just very local. But the truth is, there's stuff that goes down below and stuff that goes on up above at the ankle and at the hip that affects the position of the kneecap too. Let's go like this. So if your kneecap kind of knocks in a little bit like that, or your knee knocks in a little bit like that, the kneecap kind of slides to the outside and then puts extra pressure on the outside. And the reason why your knee might knock in a bit is either because something's happening at the hip, maybe you're rolling in a little, right? Whether that's tightness or weakness at the hip is to be discovered, or the foot is flattening in, and then again it creates this kind of angle. They call it valgus, or another name is acute angle, that kind of biases the kneecap to ride to the outside and cause extra pain. So kneecap pain or patellofemoral pain has, I like that term best as an umbrella term because lots of things feed into there, and all of the causes are pretty much the same. So if you have pain on the outside, like an ITB syndrome, I would count that as patellofemoral pain. Pain down below or on the sides of the kneecap. Sometimes people will say like, it kind of hurts like this, or there's pressure, it feels swollen. That's another symptom of patellofemoral pain. Or sometimes people will get a pull on the inside. I would say generally during an exercise, if you usually don't feel things, but if you do, you might feel a pull or like a kind of like a zing underneath the kneecap itself. And then if people would get kneecap pain later on, they might feel something that's kind of more like this, or like pain and pressure here. Those things happen later on, but they're all under the umbrella of kneecap pain. So that's a little bit of the anatomy. And then, so now the question is why? Why is this better? When? When are you feeling kneecap pain? Like I was saying, sometimes you might get some certain feelings, zings, pulling, a little off, sometimes a click, something like that during an exercise. But mostly people will feel this kind of sensation or discomfort the night of, so hours after an activity, or the next morning after the activity. And then it confuses them because they did nothing when they're feeling the pain. But the truth is, when you're feeling the pain, to know what caused it, you kind of have to look back a day or 2 days to see what you did then and if that was different in any way from your usual routine. The why, right? Kneecap pain, cartilage in general can take a lot of pressure, but it takes a steady increase of pressure, and cartilage does not like very sudden spikes in pressure. And then once it's irritated, it's easily irritable. So even if you're, let's say, a runner is a typical person who might get kneecap pain. If you've done marathons in the past and you run all the time, but you happen to take a month off for some reason, but you're still biking, but you took a month off from running for whatever reason, and then you go back into your usual base amount of running, you might get kneecap pain because it's activity specific and your body has not accommodated recently to that activity. So you kind of have to look back at your program if you're getting some of this pain and see, is there any spike in anything, whether that's speed, distance, change in activity, anything like that, and kind of review that. The other thing is kneecap pain is caused by increased tension, mostly in your quad muscle, right? The tension, so your kneecap is a fulcrum for the quad, and if the quad is super tense and not extensible, right, that's maybe another word for flexibility, instead of gliding smoothly over the femur, there's extra pressure put underneath the kneecap as you're bending and straightening your knee, whether that's with flexibility or with a contraction, with a muscle contraction. It happens, let's say, if you're not an active person, if your muscles are just starting to get tighter and tighter and tighter, you're going to feel that pain. If you are an active person, it might come along at the same time as delayed onset muscle soreness, meaning like what I was talking about before, you might feel it that night or the next morning, or maybe even a day and a half later. Generally around the same times that you would experience delayed onset muscle soreness. So that, it's called DOMS. That happens at different times for different people. Generally, I get tighter and stiffer the next morning. So if I would get kneecap pain, that's when I would feel it, my tightness and stiffness the next morning after I did something. Other ways that the tension could create a problem is when this is maybe a little bit more of an advanced conversation, but when your muscle is insufficient. So if the muscle is very stretched out, let's say all the way in this position, right? So my quad is stretching over my knee, kneecap and the hip. That's called passive insufficiency. That's when it's the weakest. So now it's trying to contract at its most weakest point because it's most stretched. So those positions could put more pressure on the kneecap. And then the other version is active insufficiency, where you're up and the muscle is the most shortened. That can put extra tension on the quad, requiring extra pressure on the kneecap. Generally with patellofemoral pain, it's more in the passively insufficient positions, but not always. Other reasons why kneecap pain happens is training issues. So, as I mentioned before, right, if you're spiking something quickly, even if you're an active person, whether that's speed, distance, impact, pressure, weight lifted, anything like that, you could cause two things. One, increased pressure on the kneecap when you're using your quad, and then also delayed onset muscle soreness, extra pressure through like a recovery inflexibility that's caused. With running, they have a kind of a rule, no more than a 10% increase in distance per week. So that's a general good rule to follow, but it doesn't apply to everybody. When you're running, you have to kind of know yourself. Maybe it's a little less, maybe you have a little bit more bandwidth, you can go a little more. It's a little bit of a trial and error. There are less rules for biking, which happens to be or cycling, which happens to be a very quad dominant activity. So that kind of biases towards tightness and pressure on the kneecap. So again, whether or not it's that 10% rule, still have an idea of how much you're using your quad and try to progress slowly as you're training. And then the same for strengthening. When you're strengthening, realize what muscle you're working, and then pay attention to the intensity of your program specifically for the quad, and work your way up slowly. If you already have kneecap pain, you can use that as a little bit of a guide. So let's say you do 10 reps of lunges today. Even though you feel like you have a lot more effort inside of you, just kind of hold it, see how you feel tonight and the next day. If there's a little bit of kneecap pain, then maybe you want to keep at that level the next session and the next session until there's no kneecap pain. And then you can progress a little bit, maybe then 2 sets of lunges the next time, and kind of use that guide like that. The other part with training issues is the ratio of the quads, the hamstrings, etc. Very often, whether or not, we'll start with cardio. Cardio is kind of easier. So let's say you're a runner and you heard that cross training is good, so then you bike too. But unfortunately, they're both very quad centric. Right? So running might, because you're not bending as far, your land gets to maybe here. Okay, that's like an eccentric quad effort to maybe 30 degrees, 40 degrees or so, right? And then the biking is where your knee's up here and you're pushing, and that's a concentric quad activity, but in a deeper range. But they're both quads. So the best way to think of your program is how much quad and hamstring are you doing. If you're on the bike, stand up a little bit so that at least you're getting different angles of the quad. Bring your hips back, especially in the spin class, to try to get a little bit more of the hamstring so that you're improving the quad to hamstring ratio. And then if you're strengthening, one, pay attention to the program, right? So for every quad dominant leg work activity, exercise, add a hamstring exercise. The only thing is, I've seen people do hamstring exercises and it's very obviously still working their quad. So you have to, just because it says hamstring dominant, feel where you're feeling it. If you feel a lot of quad effort, it's probably working your quad, even though it says on paper that that's a hamstring exercise. So training, right? Pay attention to how fast you're spiking your quad activity. Pay attention to how much hamstring work you're doing to rebalance the ratio of quad to hamstring. And then notice how much volume of quad work you're doing. If it's a lot of cardio, like running and biking, you might have to add in some strengthening that's a little bit more hamstring dominant. And then just not do the quad work with your strengthening, just build up some of the hamstring stuff, plus hips and calves. Which brings me to the next point, which is the why of patellofemoral pain, anatomy and biomechanics. So often women are plagued with kneecap pain, but men do have it too. The reason why they say women have it is because compared to men, we have wider hips. A lot of women rotate in. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not one of them. I rotate more out. And then people with flat feet, all those things. So flat feet, hip internal rotation, more distance from the hip to the knees if you have wider hips. All of those things kind of bias this X, right? That's an exaggeration. But when you're going down in a lunge, if something is weak, like your hip external rotators, or you can't control your foot, the knee knocks in and then it biases the kneecap to move out to the side or tilt or things like that. which puts extra pressure on one small part of the kneecap. And then I already mentioned the quad to hamstring ratio, right? Often, let's say, again, a woman who wears heels a lot, they have tight calves, maybe they hyperextend their knees because of it, they have weaker hamstrings, heels kind of put more of the effort on the front part of the foot, which biases your quad. All those things put extra effort on the quad and therefore extra pressure on the kneecap. So those are the what's, the where's, the why's, the how's. How do you get out of it, right? So the first step, the biggest step is stop irritating it. Unfortunately, that means you have to look at yourself and admit you're doing a couple things wrong, right? Maybe you have no program whatsoever and you need to maybe start with some flexibility of the quads. Maybe you're go, go, go and the only thing is effort and you're never working on your flexibility. So first you want mobility and then you want control of that range of motion. Maybe you have to look at your program a little bit and add some extra things in for the hips, for the calves, to improve the ratio of the quad to hamstring. And so once you do that, stop the irritating activity, then the kneecap irritation can calm down a little bit, right? Then you work on your mobility and your awareness of your program, of your hips so that they can roll in and out, of your knee, whether or not you're hyperextending a lot when you're either standing or when you're walking. Then you want to get a level of exercise consistency. If you can only work out on the weekends, you might have to bring that effort level down a little bit because you don't want spikes. So just a lower level of intensity done at least twice a week, just a little bit more consistently throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the years. Then look at your quad to hamstring ratios within your program. And just because the exercise says that it's for the hips, for the hamstrings, etc., make sure you're actually feeling no kneecap pressure and more effort in the glute or the hamstring, etc. And then the last one is once you get to a program that you feel no kneecap pain in and you're focusing on developing some quad strength and hamstring strength that's pain-free, controlling rotation. So I would say first in a patellofemoral program, we would be doing hip exercises to bring awareness. We do flexibility exercises to get the quad a little looser. But then once you start moving into things that might irritate the kneecap, you want to just be very, very still, controlling everything, being nice and straight, right? And then once that is pain-free and you get where you put your pressure on, et cetera, then being able to move into controlled rotation without the kneecap going with it. And then that's it. Then you have everything. It doesn't mean that in the future you won't have some kneecap pain, but hopefully it will be light and then you have the tools to know how to recover from that quickly, evaluate what maybe the small mistake you did that caused it, and then push forward further and further as you continue on. I hope that helped. And I'm going to put up some patellofemoral based program suggestions in the upcoming videos. Foam roller, flexibility, etc. for the quads, hip motion, control of the rotation and finding the rotation, and then some lunges and hamstring work to get you moving forward. Hope it helped. Leave some comments.